sometimes sort of plaintively, sometimes pleadingly, but he sings this one line for a whole hour nonstop. That is his show. The show as a whole is called An Epic Waste of Love and Understanding. An Epic Waste of Love and Understanding. And the title he got from an argument that he had with his then wife, when in the middle of an argument, she said to him, I hope there's not just another epic waste of love and understanding. Behind this line, though, oh, why do I keep on hurting you? I find a kernel of what we will discover is reparative intelligence. The trouble is, I think that there's just not enough people in the world who ask this question. They don't ask, oh, why do I keep on hurting you? And so I don't have to go into detail about sort of people getting hurt, people getting wounded, communities being dropped by society, politicians who just totally abuse power. I don't have to go into any of those in detail, but I think you and I will agree on the point that the world today needs reparative intelligence. It might be way more important even than something like emotional intelligence, because reparative intelligence, I think I'll show, comes first. Long before you can have emotional intelligence, you actually need reparative intelligence. And so, of course, I've used the word now a number of times, this construct of reparative intelligence, and haven't defined it. So how can we define this construct? And I define it in the following way: that reparative intelligence is discovering personal woundedness, seeking restoration for oneself, and facilitating the restoration of persons, systems, and environments in care and with compassion. The essence of reparative intelligence, and at times I catch myself using restorative intelligence. I think those can be used almost as synonyms, but you'll see out of the theory that I use and the theory that I draw upon, reparative is the language that's used, and so that's why I'm leaning towards reparative intelligence and not restorative intelligence, although I think they can be very, very similar. But the essence is pretty clear. It's a deep awareness that I was wounded in life and I carry wounds, and I need to tend to those wounds so that I can be on a path towards flourishing. And if I am more aware of my own woundedness and my own struggles, then just maybe I can open myself up to the possibility that other people are struggling too, and that the earth needs care, and that we can extend care way beyond ourselves. At the root of reparative intelligence, we find three questions which arguably might be the most difficult questions to answer. And the first question is, who am I? I would be hard pressed, but I would think that when persons come to speak to you, when you engage, whether it's CPE students or candidates or somebody of that kind, at the base of what they are really struggling with is, who am I? And of course, that question is very, very difficult to answer. In the next minutes, we will give some answers to what can be, who am I? Some answers to that question. But the second question is even more perplexing, and that is, who are we? If I can have a little bit of a sense of who I am, who are we together? And how does that play out? What is the nature of our relationship? If we are in a relationship that, oh, why do I keep on hurting you? What's really happening between us? And so before we can get to who are we, the relational component then is the other question, who are you? Do I relate to you through the mental representation I have of you in my mind? Or do I allow myself to discover you as an authentic human being? And the question of who are we and who are you are sort of intertwined. I don't even think we can separate them out all that easily. But you don't get to the one without addressing the other. So in the work that I think you do, you are trying to help and cultivate reparative intelligence in people so that they can take a more honest look at who they are, the wounds they carry, and then they can go out with a deeper sense of who they are, a deeper sense of who's the other person, and a deeper sense of what does it mean to be in community. Now, reparative intelligence is not something that I came up with, really. For me, it is more I have used and pulled together wisdom that has been in object relations theory for a number of years, as you'll soon discover. Object relations theory, of course, is this theory within psychology and psychoanalysis that is curious about sort of our relationships, our interrelationships, how we internalize relationships, how we relate to the world. And it is, for me, one of the most fascinating theories that we have, because we cannot really reduce the relationships we have. I cannot just say, as neuroscience often will do, is, well, it just all happens in the mind. It's all in the brain. And it's like all your emotional world, all your belief systems, everything just gets reduced to sort of a form of neuropsychiatry or something of that kind. Object relations looks carefully then at the way we relate to the world. And if we follow Christopher Bollas in his book, The Mystery of Things, we know that it's an 8-object psychology. Marion Milner, in her beautiful book of the Madness of Sane Men, has this concept of overlapping circles of influence, by which she means that there are aspects of our worlds that touches upon each other, and one world impacts the other. And so when you and I say we want to cultivate reparative intelligence, we are thinking of how do we do that across multiple spheres. For those of us who are more closely tied to spiritual care, Bollas says the 8th sphere, or overlapping circle, if we take Marion Milner's sort of language, is sort of God, the spirit, transcendence. It is entities and then experiences of liminality that can carry through all the way from self to the self and transcendence. So it is a fascinating journey if we think of how do we come about the awareness that we are hurting other people? How do we do that? How do I come to the awareness that I want to repair the hurt that I have caused? And how do I actually then repair a relationship, for instance? And those are the things that is at the base of what reparative intelligence is all about. The first theorist that I know of who wrote about reparative intelligence without using that exact language is Ian Sati. If you haven't read Sati's book, The Origins of Love and Hate, I would highly, highly recommend you pick up this book. Sati was a psychiatrist. He is Scottish. The book is actually published posthumously. He died in 1935, and only then the book came out. But Sati was the first theorist that I know of who, in a sustainable manner, argued for sociability, that you and I sort of evolved, we were created, if you want to use that language, to be in relationship. And so a big diversion then from Sigmund Freud. And Sati denied the fact that love might be of divine origin. He said that is not the case. He also said to love is not just a reaction out of fear, sort of the Oedipal crisis. Okay, it's not that either. And he said that love is not what he called a chemical change in the germ plasma. Those were early days to talk about basically neuroscience and neuropsychology. So Sati says we were created to be in relationship. We are relational beings. And when we are in relationship, we experience love. And he tied that love to the fact that we have a long duration before we get to maturity. He says love is a sense of responsiveness. It's a sense of responsiveness, whereas hate is anxious reactivity. When our needs are not met, we will go down the path of hateful actions or anxious reactivity, which for Sati would be things like rage, despair, shame, guilt, feeling unworthy, etc. Looking carefully at especially those early relationships that sort of formed us into who we are by and large, Sati says he notices tiny acts of gratuitous, gracious, and spontaneous attention. What he says is that even in infancy, he could notice the act of reparation unfolding. That's the tiny acts of attention that Sati is talking about. Drawing on Sati, you and I can say that when Kjartansson and others would say, oh, why do I keep on hurting you? We know that there's anxious reactivity within their person and within the system, and we want to help solve that anxious reactivity to bring it back to responsiveness, which in Sati's language would be love. Now, Donald Woods Winnicott, D.W. Winnicott, somebody that I have worked quite a bit on, and just about every book that I've written, there will be quite a bit of Winnicott in there. We don't quite know if he read Sati, and if he did, Winnicott was notorious not to reference people, so we don't quite know that. But in what I will give you in the next couple of slides, you will absolutely see that Winnicott drew heavily on Ian Sati, on the fact that in a holding environment of some kind, people feel love. When they feel love, they do not portray hate towards other and hateful sort of reactivity. And the first time Winnicott sort of wrote about this need to repair was in 1954. So a good 20 years almost after Sati already wrote about similar things. And Winnicott says the act of sort of reparation comes from this split that he thought happens somewhere between 6 months and 18 months. And he had a broad sort of category of when it would happen. But this deep awareness in the infant that there's another person, most often the mother or the parental caregiver, who's not me. We've all experienced that. We've picked up an infant, and if you wear glasses, soon your glasses will be ripped off. If you have long hair, your hair will be pulled. And it's as if the infant has no real awareness that you are there, and when your hair is pulled, it actually hurts. Has no awareness of that fact. And Winnicott said, when that awareness comes in, that there is a me and a not me, there's a me and an other, there's a me and mother. When that awareness sets in, the aggressive impulses that a child has sort of compels them to feel they've caused hurt and they need to repair that hurt. So Winnicott, a couple of years later, he started writing about sort of a benign circle that we find. Sort of the instinctual experience sets in, aggression. I grab, I want to explore, I want to touch, I want to feel. And then because I'm doing that with another person who I've now just hurt, sort of a sense of responsibility or guilt kind of sets in. And as we try to make sense of what we have done, in Winnicott's language, a restitutive gesture, that is Ian Sati's tiny act of reparation, okay, comes forward. In various other places, Winnicott would write about the spontaneous gesture or the gift gesture, but it is the young infant and the young child recognizing either a family rule was transgressed, recognizing that hurt was caused, and now the infant comes back and wants to make amends. When I have two adult daughters at the moment, but when they were young and they felt that kind of guilt, they would sort of just kind of come up to my leg and sort of hold me, and not even use words, but just kind of be there. And that is the spontaneous gesture. That is the act of reparation. If you're a clinician, you know that in other ways. You know that in the client who will come in and week after week will say that the therapy is not working, this is not helping me, and all of those things. And then lo and behold, you send a bill and the bill is paid immediately and on time. The act of reparation, the spontaneous gesture. It's the person who was this thorn in the flesh person who suddenly gives you a compliment. And you think, where does this compliment actually come from? How did that come about? So this spontaneous gesture then grew within Winnicott, and a couple of years later, let me go this way, and then you can see 1963, he named the capacity for concern. The capacity for concern as a developmental achievement. It is something that you and I have to strive towards, and if we get the capacity for concern, suddenly we begin to care, we mind, and we feel responsible. Now, this for me is really sort of a very important moment, because as I look into the world, I do not see a lot of people, especially people in leadership, but you can go into any discussion forum online and you'll see it is not just leaders, it's pervasive in this world. But you see and recognize a lot of people who just do not care. They do not mind. They do not feel and act responsibly. And so how on earth are we going to help a society towards flourishing? How are we going to help a society who will care not only for its citizens, but also for the earth, if people lack the capacity for concern? Now, Winnicott says that he likes the word concern, and I like that word too, that construct, because he doesn't like the word guilt. Now, when he uses that, of course, in the back of Winnicott's mind lurks Melanie Klein, who in 1936, so long after Sati already published on these things, in 1936, Melanie Klein said, we have these two basic sort of stances in life: the paranoid schizoid position, which translates into you are either all good or all bad. And it plays out in that I often feel persecuted by you if you are bad. So that's the paranoid schizoid position. The other position she called the depressive position. And the depressive position is I am all good and all bad. And because I'm also all bad, I can cause hurt. I can hurt you. Because I feel I hurt you, I feel guilty. And out of the guilt that I carry, I want to make the act of reparation again. So again, Winnicott here drawing heavily on Melanie Klein without giving any reference to where he got that knowledge. So the spontaneous gesture, the act of reparation, always surprises us. If you are familiar with Wendy Holloway's book, The Capacity to Care, it's a wonderful book. If you haven't read it, she tells of how one of her clients took kids to school, and the kids were bickering and fighting sort of on the back seat, and as happens with parents who are probably tired because they have young kids and lots of responsibility and stress and anxiety, she stopped the car, she turned around and she started yelling at her kids. And then one of her children from the back seat just started stroking her, the act of reparation, while another child who was only 2 years old said, "It's all right, mommy. it's all right. So the spontaneous gesture, this act of reparation, says something about our holding environments. And when I say that I look out into the world and I see a lot of people lacking this capacity, that I see a lot of people who do not care, who do not mind, what we're saying at the same time is that there has been a collapse in holding environments. Now, Winnicott loved the word holding. He said holding sort of represents the whole sort of situation, is language that he would use, the whole atmosphere that welcomes a child into the world. And he thought about that as a loving sort of situation, a caring place where people tend to the physical and also the emotional needs of especially an infant. As parents, we know that holding changes and it shifts and drifts. And my guess is if you're a clinician, you have done some work with families and parents to help them shift the way that they hold their children, because you cannot hold a toddler, which means you tend to that holistic needs of your child. You cannot do that in the same way as when your child is a teenager or when your child is a young adult. Holding constantly shifts. And as a clinician, whether you're a chaplain who goes into a patient's room or where you are sitting in an interpersonal group in CPE training, well, what you are trying to do is you are trying to create a holding environment that gives life to others. So my belief that our culture in general has lost holding environments and have lost an awareness of the importance of holding environments is a pretty sad statement. But in my view, it's also a true statement. Winnicott says that what happens when an holding environment fails, when the holding environment no longer tends to the emotional and the relational, the physical, we can add the spiritual needs of a person. When that happens, people intuitively will go down the path of what he called antisocial acts. That would be exactly what Sati said in sort of anxious reactivity. They will go to that place to compel, to force the environment to become significant to them again. Winnicott says it's as if the child reaches back to a time where they were loved, they were cared for, they did have the holding environment that gave them a life and that nourished them. And then somehow that disappeared and they long for that to return. So the background of this sort of antisocial act for Winnicott was during World War II, when the British government decided to relocate lots and lots of children out of almost all the big cities. And they sent the children to rural areas so that the Nazi bombers, when those planes would come from Nazi Germany and drop bombs on London and Manchester and other cities, that the kids would be not in harm's way. And Winnicott was a consultant for the British government. And they suddenly recognized that children who were doing just fine and they were loving, playful kids, age-appropriate kids, suddenly they get removed to a foster family, often a farming community in rural UK, and they would begin to steal, they would begin to run away, they would begin to lie, they would be going into aggressive acts, all behavior new to that children. And so when we say then that holding environments are failing, what we are also saying is that we can expect, in the language of Winnicott, we can expect a lot of antisocial behavior. We can expect behavior that will be anxious and reactive. I had the privilege of being outside of the country for the last 15 months. And so I did not follow much of American news, American politics, because I was in different parts of the world. But being back just a month, it is hard not to escape the anxious reactivity that is within our system. It permeates cultural life within the US. And Joyce Ann Slockhauer then says, for persons to discover themselves anew, they need to find a holding environment. And I think that's what you are doing for the students you're teaching. That's what you are doing in your chaplaincy. That's what you're doing as a clinician. You are creating holding environments. But holding environments is really difficult, because to sustain that holding environment, you have to survive the relentless attacks of the person who came to you for help. We can expect that because the person coming for help, as I've said, without using any of the words, they kind of admitted that I am in need of reparative intelligence. I don't have that. I want to figure out, who am I? I want to figure out, who are you? And I want to figure out, who are we together? So when somebody comes and tries to go on a therapeutic journey of any kind, or a journey of growth even, I think we can just expect these sort of relentless attacks. I remember well, 25 plus years ago when I did my clinical training, and I had a patient who was, she had some paranoia, some schizophrenia in her life, and how difficult and painful it was for me to sustain those relentless attacks and not to take it personally, and to sit with somebody week in and week out, and you don't really see any progress. And you're asking, am I really helping this person? Do I have restorative and reparative intelligence enough to assist this individual on their journey? When we do invite somebody into a space that is a holding environment, so this space tends to the emotional needs, this space can survive the relentless attacks. And Winnicott sort of gave us hints of how to survive. He said the person always has what he called the object mother, or we can say the object clinician, the object pastor, the object chaplain in their mind. And it is this sort of mashup of how they think about who a counselor, who a chaplain, who a therapist should be. It's just a mashup. What they found that in movies, they found that in popular psychology, they found that through other experiences, news media, and now they are relating to you as the object other. But Winnicott said that you are the environment other, not the object other. You are actually a real person of flesh and blood. And just like a mom hurts when that infant bites the nipple, it really hurts when the persons we work with sort of are angry and frustrated with us, and they let us know in no uneven terms. So when you and I can survive those attacks by reminding ourselves that the person is struggling with the object me, but I'm not the object me. I am the environment, flesh and blood me. And if I can sustain these attacks, the person will discover that. When we do that, deep feeling can be welcomed. Alice Miller, in her book, The Prisoners of Childhood, basically says that we have to, as individuals, we have to discover the truth of our childhoods. The truths of our childhoods are probably one of the most difficult things to discover. I'm convinced you have worked with people that had no memory up to the age of 10, 11, 12. And then as you go on a therapeutic journey with them, suddenly they gain memory. So a therapeutic journey is sort of weird in the sense that you don't go into a therapeutic journey because of memories you have. You actually go on a therapeutic journey to discover memories that you have had, but you cannot feel those memories because it's painful. The truth of our childhoods, in Alice Miller's terms, is that we know misattunement intimately. Misattunement is just being in a position where your needs were not quite met because the caregivers around you, parents and others, was not attuned to the needs that you actually brought. Winnicott gives us a wonderful metaphor that is part and parcel of reparative intelligence. And he says those moments of misattunement, those moments where our childhoods really hurt, what happens to us is that we take those moments and we freeze them up solid. We turn them into frozen moments. And as long as they stay frozen, they don't hurt. And we can seemingly go on as if nothing has happened. And I say seemingly because what we are doing is we're spending enormous amounts of spiritual, relational, and other energies to keep those painful moments frozen. When you and I enter into a holding environment where we feel loved, where we feel secure, where we feel supported, we can begin to thaw those frozen moments. There's no thawing taking place without pain. There's no thawing taking place without feeling hurt all over again. And now, of course, you're going to be the caregiver. And as that hurt sets in, and the patient or the person you're working with needs to defend themselves against that hurt, they're going to take it out on you. And your call is to survive those attacks so that the thawing of frozen moments can take place. I sometimes think that whether it's for persons and families, definitely society, that there's so much hurt frozen that individuals and partners and families do not have energy left to actually invest in a relationship. They just don't have anything left, which leaves them vulnerable for those anxious reactivities, those hateful moments that sets in when our needs are not met. Not all of us will be able to follow Michael Eigen in the language that he uses, though, around this theme. So Eigen would agree with Alice Miller, would agree with Winnicott and a bunch of others, who basically says, yes, we carry a lot of hurt around our childhoods. And there is certainly hurt that occurs later in life, absolutely. But a lot of the hurt that we carry came from our early years of life. And so Eigen uses this language of the annihilated self. In a class recently that I taught, I used this concept with students. And there wasn't a single student who liked the term the annihilated self. Not a single one wanted to embrace that word. But what I want to take away from Eigen is that most, if not all, cells walking around the earth today are cells that is hurt. They've been hurt, and now they live out the destruction that they have experienced towards others. I love this line where he says, my hope is that making room for the annihilated self will enable us to be less destructive. We often injure, even destroy each other in order to reach the realness of our annihilated selves. I agree with Eigen when he says that talking through our childhoods, talking with someone, is a way, way better choice than just being destructive in a very unconscious kind of way. Because we carry then wounded selves with us, because we carry lots and lots of frozen moments, you and I pursue the transformational object. So Christopher Bollas, again, draws heavily on Winnicott in this regard. Remember, Winnicott said that the infant, as the infant separates from primary caregivers, would get the transitional object. The transitional object would be a blanket, a soft toy, can be a thumb that's being sucked. But that transitional object assists a child, especially around times of transition. Mom and dad or the parental caregiver suddenly disappear. And now if I hold on to my blankie, my soft toy, I can sustain that separation. So when it was for entrances and exits in the morning especially, but also like waking and sleeping, waking as an entrance and then as an exit, a child needs that transitional object. You and I as parents know we do not go on vacation and say to our child, sorry, the car is fully packed, your teddy bear is not coming along on this ride. We don't do that because we know enormous amounts of anxiety will be unleashed. And so Bollas says when the transitional object for a child is a possession, they own that object. What happens in adulthood is that we pursue an object or a relationship that will transform the way we feel, think, or feel. The first archetypal narrative that I know of in my tradition, which is sort of Christianity, that draws on this transformational object is Eve. Long before Eve in the Garden of Eden took a fruit, she heard the message, do you want to have wisdom? Do you want to be transformed? And Eve said, yes, I want to be transformed. The desire to be transformed is optimal. When a client calls you up for your practice, when you get a call from the nursing staff or maybe even a patient in the hospital and says they would love to have a visit from the chaplain, what that person is really telling you is, I am in need of the transformational object. There are some dynamics within me, whether it's anxiety or uncertainty or loneliness or depression, but there's some dynamics in me that I would love to address. Your task and my task is, can we listen carefully enough? Can we actually be that transformational presence? When you and I do not listen well, when we do not listen carefully, it is near impossible for us to be the transformational object. So let me take just a second to summarize what I've already argued for, okay? I basically said that reparative intelligence is this awareness that we are wounded as persons and that we are seeking restoration or reparation for ourselves because of that. And because we have received some form of healing, some form of reparation, we want to participate in the restoration of others and systems. And this occurs best, this discovery, this growth, the cultivation of reparative intelligence, it happens best within holding environments. And so when we say this as a basis for you and me, that takes us right into caring. Because the moment that you and I gain only some awareness of reparative intelligence, we begin to care. Joan Tronto, if you have not, and if you're not familiar with Joan Tronto, a phenomenal theorist who have published multiple books on care and the ethics of care. She teaches at the University of Pennsylvania, a wonderful scholar, and I can highly, highly recommend picking up some of her thoughts. But what I love about her is that she defines care very much along the lines that I would define what is reparative intelligence. She says, care is an activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and to repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. If I bemoan the fact that we do not have a caring world, that society by and large reflects more apathy than care, I think I'm joined by somebody like Tronto, who will say that in especially the North American society, and a lot of her books focuses on North America, especially in our society, we need care, this ability to repair the world in which we live. So the moment you and I engage the journey of reparative intelligence, you and I begin to grow in the kinds of emotional sharing we can do. Emotional sharing is just what the word suggests. It is, what is the quality of the emotional relationship that I'm in? Apathy, which to me would be the one extreme on this spectrum, is basically the whatever mentality. You know, I mean, for us who had teenagers, when our teenagers would use whatever language, they basically would say, I just don't care. I don't want to be in a relationship with you. I don't care what happens. That is apathy. At the other extreme end of this spectrum, you find compassion and care. And it's really difficult for me to distinguish between those two, because compassion is the awareness that there's personal and communal suffering. And now you have a sympathetic response. I feel with you. That is what sympathy is. And in compassion, there's this desire to take action and to bring change. Empathy was brought into our vocabulary in around 1873. It's a relatively young word. Up to 1873, we didn't even know what empathy was. But Robert Vischer, a German sort of philosopher, distinguished between Mitfühling, sympathy, I feel with, to Einfühling, which would be empathy. So it's a relatively new word. And in our culture, we have elevated empathy as something really important, that empathy is where we have to grow into. But I think I would argue that no, we have to grow into care and compassion, because empathy is, I imagine myself into somebody else's shoes. That typically is what empathy is. And now I'm expressing what I imagine. But we know that our imagination is just most often bluntly wrong. And can I live here in a state that has draconian laws to persons who are transgendered and non-binary on the sexuality spectrum. Can I really, as a heterosexual male, imagine myself into somebody else's shoes? We can't. Care and compassion takes action. It changes the world, according to Tronto, so that we can live in it much, much better. But the moment you and I want to cultivate reparative intelligence, the moment you and I want to create these holding environments where people can learn, where they can mind, they can feel responsible, they can care and bring change, the moment you and I want to do that, we discover enormous pushback from culture. I'm going to go through this last section fairly fast. Maybe we can revisit that in the Q&A section as well. But I want to highlight four dynamics that is super important in our world today, I believe. And it's important because it's people like you who can help society around these very concerns. It's not going to come from politicians. It's going to come from people like you and me. And the first theme is that today's culture is thoroughly confused about the self and what is a self. If I want to use different language, culture is confused about what does it mean to be a human being. And so what we have is we have a human being that is extremely minimalized, reduced, and then regulated. And when the regulation goes in the form of male politicians regulating female bodies, we get into real contentious and dangerous areas. So Jody Mesler-Davies, in her beautiful article, where she introduces us the kaleidoscopic self, that is what we have to encourage people to discover. The kaleidoscopic self literally implies that, like a kaleidoscope, that if you turn it, the prisms inside keeps on spinning and the image keeps on shifting over and over again. She says that's actually the nature of the self. We have all kinds of experiences, and every time the experience happens, it's like a turn of that tube, and the self comes out with all its multiplicity, with all its diversity, that we are not so homogeneous. We're not a unit so much, but we have different parts of who we are. As long as culture remains stuck in a very anemic, simple understanding of what does it mean to be a self, reparative intelligence will be void. It will not be even on the horizon. But a second power that is so ominous in today's world is that of technology. Maybe at another time we can have a long conversation about technology, but technology is absolutely the biggest power source in our world today. As an intersectional power, it is more powerful than racism and sexism and homophobia and all the other isms that we know of, because it can co-opt those other intersectionalities and just run with it in a way that it sees fitting. A telling study happened in around 2011, this study took place, but it was a study that tracked first-year students at the University of Michigan over a 30-year period. They used the exact same instrument to test the incoming class at U of M. And Sarah Conrath and her colleagues discovered that the one trait they measured, which they call the trait of empathy concern, how much empathy do you have, declined 40% in students over 30 years. What the research indicates is just people just care less. They don't care. They don't mind. They don't feel responsible. And in the discussion section of the article, when Conrath and her colleagues try to figure out why is this happening, they blame technology as the source of the decline of empathy concern. The third big driver in culture that I think is pervasive and absolutely undermines the prevalence of reparative intelligence is shame. Shame, I think, is the thread that holds American culture together. I have never read of a school shooter who goes into those destructive deeds who does not know shame intimately. If you look at our political rhetoric, it's all about shaming the other. If you look at how mental illness is being treated in the US, it's all about shaming. If you look at how homelessness and poverty is being addressed, it's always through the lens of shame. Thomas Sheff is a scholar who studied shame for about 40 years. He has published many books, many articles on shame, and he is clear that as shame increases, people die, people get hurt. You and I have to help culture overcome shame. And then the last theme that I want to highlight as a narrative of culture that undermines reparative intelligence is actually the lack of narratives. We do not have stories where people can find themselves in, where they can find themselves along a plot line of some kind. They live what Douglas Rushkoff, a media theorist, what he says, they live by hit singles. What does he mean by that? They live on Twitter and TikTok and Facebook and instant messaging and things of that kind. And whatever comes in immediately is what I address. We need big narratives where people can find themselves within the narrative. Of course, faith traditions can offer much to society in this regard. So I conclude, because I guess it'll be a question and we can go deeper into it. Yeah, we've been all along talking about reparative intelligence through virtual means. And can we cultivate reparative intelligence virtually? In online counseling and in those kinds of settings. And I think the verdict is that it's difficult to discern. If you go with Gillian Russell in her book, Screen Relations, she's going to say, no, we cannot really do that well. We cannot cultivate reparative intelligence because we miss so many of the cues that is in a relationship, especially the nonverbal communications. Her image is, and this is a quote from a counselor that she interviewed, it's like trying to see someone better by shouting. But if we turn to Chaim Weinberg's book, The Paradox of Internet Groups, I would say yes, we can absolutely cultivate reparative intelligence through online means. Weinberg challenges us to think differently about the self. Maybe the self is not two bodies connecting in relationship, but maybe the self is much bigger. Today we are extended selves. We live phone in hand. We are extended selves. And so how, if we think differently about the self, just maybe virtual means open up to us as well. So my friends, my challenge to you is to become agents of reparative intelligence. Empower, cultivate in others this ability to not only recognize personal woundedness, but to seek restoration from themselves so that they can participate in the restoration of systems and the world. May the challenge that I place upon you to be an agent of reparative intelligence not be a burden, but may it affirm what you do already. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have a couple of questions that I'm going to come to in a minute. And if others of you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A or in the chat. I'll be monitoring both places. I want to start by thanking you, Dr. Hamman. It's quite stimulating. I kept thinking about at the end when you were talking about what technology does to us and how during the pandemic, when all of life was, I remember bursting into tears when I realized I was spending about 60 hours a week on Zoom and had not been in the physical presence of another human being for 13 weeks, right? It was just, what that did to all of us. And we're seeing the aftermath in our practice and everything. And so, I mean, I have a note here. We will have that further conversation about technology somewhere down the road. But I'm also very interested in, particularly since most of us are still in religious and faith communities, hearing out, being aware of how many people would, without using your language, agree with you that a lot of our problems is we don't have these holding environments and we don't have these narratives. So the offered solution is, therefore, blame women for leaving the home, go back to the home, and blame people for not being in their 1950s style churches. maybe not 50s, 80s, whatever. But anyway, it's interesting to sort of see that and to wonder as we encounter people, is there some sort of response that gets beyond that limited, out of date solution to the actual way of engaging the underlying problem?
Yeah, thank you, Terry. Absolutely true. I think the biggest role that folk like you can play, and those on this call, is to educate faith communities about the nature of the self, the nature of relationships. Excuse me, what does it mean to be a human being and have meaning and purpose in life? And then to help folk connect to larger narratives. The problem of especially sort of the Judeo tradition, Christian tradition, is that it is often about moments. There's the moment of salvation, for instance, or moments. And moments is not a narrative that you can live into. But there are beautiful narratives in Scripture that is, as Rushkoff indicates, it's a whole plot line. Personally, I love the narrative of Joel, which basically says there was a people who know loss. They came together to mourn, grieve, and lament. While they were together, they discovered a compassionate God who poured out God's Spirit on people. They wanted to be accountable, and they wanted to make a difference in the world. That is the plot line of the book of Joel summarized. But I think it'll be people like you and me who invites folk into that larger narrative. And I think we just have to be advocates. We have to be advocating for women and children, lots of folk who sort of silently dismissed by tradition. And if you and I are not going to do that, who is going to help the church discover a sort of a deeper understanding of what does it mean to be a human being? Ultimately, and to me, this is a real sadness, because faith communities minimize their understanding of human beings, they absolutely minimize their understanding of the divine at the same time. So we need to invite folk into positions where they can discover God anew, as lots of narratives in especially the Hebrew Bible would say that God is compassionate and gracious and slow to anger, but that there's a mysterious component tied to God. So yeah, I think you and I have our work cut out to assist faith communities to grow and learn in ways that may just be very uncomfortable for many at this time.
I have a couple of questions here that I think are a little more theoretical, back to some of your presentation. The first one says, can these frozen moments happen in adulthood, like trauma, or even earlier, not just the childhood adverse experiences?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, if research indicates 1 in 3 girls, maybe even a little bit higher, probably will experience some form of sexual abuse, sexual molestation before the age of 18. There's lots of ways how trauma becomes frozen moments. Absolutely, that is case. And I think at Vanderbilt, I teach in our Doctorate of Ministry program. We have a lot of veterans and chaplains, military chaplains in our program, and we talk about that a lot, actually, how for veterans coming back from war fronts and other places, how they carry a lot of frozen moments with them. I think the sad part for me is that a lot of those wounds that they experience in adulthood is just mimicking almost the exact same wounds they know from childhood. And they've learned how to protect themselves well from those early wounds. And now the new wounds are compiled on top of it. So absolutely, I think as adults, when we experience trauma, when we experience pain and loss and grief, it can very, very easily become another frozen moment. If we have discovered some reparative intelligence along the way, though, we will engage those moments differently. We will probably say, I've had horrible experiences on the war front. I need to put myself in a relationship where I can process this. because I don't want to hurt me, my partners, my partner, my parenting. I don't want to hurt my kids. No, those kinds of things. But absolutely, it's not tied only to childhood.
I do think what you're saying sort of also still goes back to our theory too about we have these moments and the difference between two people who encounter the same trauma and the difference in coping capacity.
Exactly, and for no two people it will be the same. Yes, and so that's where our skill will come in how do you cultivate the holding environment for everyone that you meet, and you'll have to custom fit, custom make as you go along. Yeah.
So I have some other questions coming in here. How do transitional and transformational objects work together?
I think there is a time where you sort of grow out of your transitional object and you go for the transformational object. And I think it comes with age. I do think the transitional object is a possession. It is that soft toy. It is a blanket. It is a pacifier. And at some point, probably because of cultural pressures and parental pressures, you kind of grow out of it. You get the message, you're old enough, you don't need this anymore. That kind of message you get. But I think as that happens, you and I begin to pursue the transformational object. And the transformational object is not always a good object. I do a lot of work with physicians in my system at my medical center. And I have worked with physicians who feel totally stressed out. They feel unrecognized, not affirmed. And then their transitional object would become gambling and alcohol and pornography. And those are all, transformational objects too, but not healthy ones. It takes you on pathways of destruction. And I think this is where reparative intelligence can help us. If I know that some forms of self-medication, some forms of pursuing, we chase after the transformational object, some of it can just be very, very dangerous. So there might be probably around the ages, I would say 10 to 12, 13, 14, in that age range, where there's an overlap. I still have my teddy bear that I carry along, and I'm also pursuing ways of changing the way I feel, changing the way I think. But I think there comes a time where in maturity, you leave the transitional object behind. And some of it, there's a lot of things we can say about that. So for instance, one of the things that would be a big distinction between the transitional object and the transformational object is that Winnicott said the transitional object is lovingly mutilated. So for instance, a child will drag their blankie behind them and doesn't seem to care that it's going to pieces by dragging it around. Chewing it to pieces, doesn't mind that it's getting chewed up, So some of the aggressive impulses are taken out on the transitional object who survives that aggression. But in adulthood, we pursue experiences, which doesn't always help us get rid of the anger and the aggression and all of those things all that easily. Good question, though. Thank you.
Thank you. There's someone here asking if you could speak to how moral injury, being hurt ourselves as we hurt others, may complicate and or be a catalyst for reparative intelligence.
Well, thank you. Yeah. So moral injury, in my understanding, would be where we find ourselves within a certain kind of system that is breaching my own ethical code. So to serve the system, I am doing things that is breaching my own personal code. Okay, so that's typically what I see as moral injury. And I think moral injury is really difficult and becomes a frozen moment because it is almost always fused with power that comes from a power system. And it happens in systems where you and I have very little say to change the system. It's just not going to happen, because we are sort of at the receiving end of all of these things. So I think moral injury can easily become another frozen moment, but also it can become a very painful place where that anxious reactivity that Sati sort of shared with us, where that anxious reactivity comes out. So it may not be that I sort of remember the idea of a frozen moment is I keep it frozen so that my life can go on as normal as anything. Other people won't even know I have this deep pain, because that's how deeply it's frozen. In anxious reactivity, people will notice, because my behavior will show, it will tell something is out of whack, something is off balance. And so I think moral injury, in the way that I experience often, is more tied to those outward acts that people have. I've seen in my own journey, I've seen a lot of self-medication. I've seen a lot of destructiveness in interpersonal relationships. And yes, there's definitely a tie-in with the frozen moments, but I see more the anxious reactivity outwards when it comes to moral injury. Moral injury is one of those super difficult things to talk about, because our culture doesn't want to admit the atrocities that our government has done and is doing on our behalf and with our tax dollars. So that makes it really, really difficult to talk about that in big settings.
All right, I got a bunch of questions coming in here now all of a sudden. So let's see. People were saying it was so much and they're so appreciative of this when they're digesting. So we will definitely have more conversation. I have a question. Is it a fair paraphrase of your reparative intelligence to say that people have an innate capacity to know which way the light is, to know what will heal, to know the way better? And yes or no to that question, what do people look or sound like when they are exercising reparative intelligence? This person loved your example of the kids with their mother when she slammed on the brakes, and wondered if some other examples would be helpful.
Absolutely. I side myself 100% with Winnicott, who believed that there's a natural sense of guilt. And when he used the language of a natural sense of guilt, he basically poked at the Christian tradition. And remember, he grew up Methodist, and then he went Anglican, but he was a lifelong church member. He poked at the Christian tradition, who wanted to induce a sense of guilt by telling people, you're a sinner and you're in need of salvation, that kind of language. And so I do believe that the capacity for concern in Winnicott's terms, reparative intelligence, is innate to all of us. I really do believe that. And I do believe that it is in all of us because we had enough of a holding environment to survive. If we had a holding environment in infancy that was just pure anxious hostility, I don't think infants survive those kinds of settings very well. And so what Winnicott then reminds us is that reparative intelligence is actually a hunkering back, a moving back to something that we all know intuitively. We all know intuitively when we are wounded. We know intuitively I can engage the act of reparation. We can do that. Sometimes I think people just need permission to actually do that. And what makes it very difficult is that we discovered that act of reparation pre-verbally. It was already, if Winnicott is correct, that it happened somewhere between 6 and 18 months, it happened long before we had language, long before we could even give language. And I think that's why children would just come up and give you a hug. There's no words being expressed, So yeah, how can we create the holding environments where something that is very natural, reparative intelligence, can come out again and be a part of a person's life?
Your answer touches on a couple of questions that are in different directions, but one is asking, is there more to say about how faith communities can address shame?
Absolutely, yeah. I think So that archetypal narrative in the Garden of Eden, okay, can be read in four ways. The first way is actually what I've already given, that it is about the desire for transformation. Long before Eve transgressed the rules that was handed down in the Garden of Eden, long before she had that, she had the desire to be transformed. It is a primal desire we all carry at all times. So we need to say to church and faith communities, speak about that desire for transformation. What does it look like? And how can we assist with that transformation? The second way to read that archetypal narrative would be then sort of the guilty self. If the first one is the desiring self, I want to desire transformation. The second one is the guilty self. I transgressed a law. Now, especially Christianity has built massive theologies around that. We don't even have to explore it much. We know about guilt and atonement theories and all of those things. But that's only a second way to read that narrative. The third way is actually the narrative of shame. So the story goes, Adam and Eve took the fruit, and suddenly they discovered they were naked and they had to go into hiding. So right in that very first narrative we have about relational life in the Garden of Eden, shame is prominent. What makes it difficult for faith communities to talk about shame, though, is that pastors especially experience shame probably more than most other people, and it's tied to the higher level of narcissism that pastors carry. The underbelly of narcissism is actually shame. If you are a narcissist and you are challenged, you're going to experience that challenge in a shaming way, and now you have to protect yourself against that shame. I've just finished the book. It'll be out in a couple of months. The title is going to be The Essence of Leadership, Managing Self Before Leading Others, Managing Self Before Leading Others, and it's going to be the essence of leadership. And in the book, I argue how leaders in general do shame poorly because it takes a certain level of narcissism to actually be a leader. And now we become defensive when people challenge us. We protect ourselves against self-shame. And so, yeah, so faith communities, we have to talk about shame. We have to empower our parents not to discipline with shame. So they've moved away, by and large, in many places from corporal punishment, and that was a very good thing. But I think they've just replaced it by shaming kids, and that's not a good thing. And then, of course, the fourth way how to read that narrative is through the lens of loss. So there's Adam and Eve expelled from the garden, and they know loss intimately. And so if we have the narrative of the Garden of Eden, and the only narrative we tell people is about don't transgress, and if you are transgressing, you are guilty, and if you are guilty, here's the atonement theory you can use to rectify your relationship with God anymore. I mean, that is a very minimalist reading of that text. Shame is actually my new project that I'm working on, but it will not be ready for a number of years, where I'm trying to show how shame is the thread that holds the American tapestry together. I fully believe that.
Wow. Wow. I have three questions here that I'm going to read all three because though they are different, they're related, and we're coming up on time. So I'm going to let you kind of pick because they're all related to how we live in the world as it is today. One says, history tells me that the world is in a relative place of peace, less violence, more attentive parenting, more options for people, etc. So why does this high degree of anxiety, reactivity, decreased empathy, increased apathy, etc. exist? And then there's one that says, as change agents, any advice on how we can address the broader societal issues, for example, teachers getting reprimanded for teaching about slavery or the writing of history book, and these actions contribute to exacerbating human traumas. And then the third one is, can Dr. Hamman explain in more detail what it means, the political discipline, the dimension, the political dimension or understanding of the ethics of care. So here's all of this, you know, they're different arrows into that same question.
Let me give it a stab and see what happens here. I believe that the divisiveness that we have, especially in North America, has been fueled in the most extreme ways by technology, actually. It is technology that was created about 8-9 years ago, where they've learned how to use the algorithms that is built around every single one on this call. And they have learned how to uniquely identify within your algorithm those trigger points that will get your attention. It was actually, and you may know the name from the previous election, Cambridge Analytics. Cambridge Analytics was a firm. They looked at millions of Facebook people, and they could say, if you address these themes, you've got the people's attention. And the previous president and his team paid Cambridge Analytics to get a list of those themes and started pushing that out on all media platforms in a big flood. And because the algorithms are correct, those are the trigger points that you will grab a person's attention if you push these little buttons. That's exactly what happens. So our political world is so divisive and so polarized because of fake news, because of the way that AI, artificial intelligence, is being used in today's world. Now, let me give a little bit of because we are really running out of time here. Let me say something about politics, okay? Politics, the word politics literally means the shape of the city. That's what the word politics means. And so you and I want to be politicians, not in the way that we know two-party systems and some others on the side, but we want to be politicians because you and I are always shaping the city. We either shape the city with our silence and our apathy and our isolation and distance, or we shape the city by advocacy, involvement, etc. So how do we change the political world? I would say choose one area in your society where you want to become involved with and shape the city differently there. As you read early on, I decided I'm going to help persons with autism, Down syndrome, persons who live with a developmental disability, and I'm going to give them custom-made housing. I'm going to get them out of mom and dad's house. I'm going to give them employment, and they will flourish in society. I do not have any history in my family of those kinds of persons in my family. But to me, that's just my way of saying, here I can make a difference, and I'm trying to do that. You and I want to be politicians, and because we bring reparative intelligence, we will shape the city according to life-giving values.
Well, there is a good note for us to stop. The question we didn't get to, and I'm telling you, because I'm on the committee, we're going to have you back to talk about technology, had to do with reparative moments in online therapy and some things about that. So we will come back to that with a lot of time. And I can't thank you enough. This has been very stimulating for me, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and also inspirational in thinking about how I live in the world. So I thank you so much. Let me remind everyone who's still on the call that to get your CEs, there you have to fill out the 2 forms that came with your registration link. If you don't have that or can't find it, email me. I put my email address. I'm trying to help Rachel out a little bit here. So you can email me and I'll send it to you again.
Thanks, everyone. Take good care. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jaco.
Great to be with you all.
Thank you. You're getting lots of people thanking you and telling you what an awesome presentation it was in the comments. So
Thank you, Terry. Thank you so much.
yeah. Okay, well, do you need anything else from me?
Nope. I think it's just us. And I just want to thank you, Terry. Thank you for making it a very good experience for me too. I appreciate that.
You are so welcome. It's a delight to meet you. And when next I see the Hasbrook's, I will tell them about who have not changed the way that their name is pronounced. But they live in DC, so that's a little bit different, right? You know?
Well, maybe if they stayed 30 years like I have, things just begins to change. You know? But thank you so much, and I was deeply honored being with you today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. All right. Well, I'm going to end the chat and
Yep.
end the recording and
And
end
I'm
the
leaving
meeting.
too. Take good care.
Thank you so much. All right. Bye-bye.